The German tank commander heard it before he saw it, and what he heard made no sense. It was September 1944 in the farm country around Arracourt in eastern France, and the column of German armor grinding along the hedgerow road was doing what German armor did best: moving fast, moving hard, staying under the trees where the dreaded American fighter bombers could not easily find it. Men in the tanks had learned to fear the sky. They had learned to fear the scream of a diving thunderbolt, the sudden bloom of rockets, the way an entire column could be turned into burning scrap in 90 seconds by aircraft they never saw coming. So they knew the sounds of the sky. And this was not one of them. This was a small sound, a puttering sewing machine sound. The sound of a lawnmower with wings. It was the sound of an L-4 Grasshopper, a Piper Cub, the flimsiest, gentlest aircraft over the entire front. A little high-wing puddle jumper of fabric and tube and doped canvas that the artillery used to spot targets. Everyone on both sides knew the Cubs. They floated over the battlefield at 50 miles an hour like dragonflies, unarmed and harmless, circling to call down artillery fire and then buzzing home. You did not waste ammunition on a Cub. You barely looked up. The German commander barely looked up. That was the last mistake several of his tanks would ever make. Because this particular Cub was diving, if you could call the mushy, groaning descent of a Piper Cub a dive, straight down the length of the column, and bolted to its wing struts, 3 under each wing, jury-rigged with wire and prayer, and a homemade firing switch on the panel, were 6 bazookas, infantry anti-tank rockets, strapped to an airplane made of cloth, and the man flying it was grinning. His name was Major Charles Carpenter, and back home in Illinois, he was a high school history teacher, and right now he was lining up the top deck of a German tank, the thin roof armor, the one place a bazooka could bite, and he thumbed the switch. The little plane staggered as the rockets left the rails, backblast washing over the wings, and on the road below, a tank brewed up in a gout of flame and black smoke. Carpenter hauled the Cub around in a wide, wallowing turn, the whole airframe shuddering, and came back for another pass, and another. On days like this one, he would land in a field, throw fresh bazooka tubes onto the struts by hand while the engine still ticked, and take off again, in one action firing something like 16 rockets in repeated runs against armor that outweighed his aircraft by a factor of 50. The Germans had a war full of terrors: the Tiger, the 88, the Stuka, the fighter bomber. They did not have a name for this, because this was not supposed to be possible. A spotter plane does not attack a tank. A history teacher does not hunt tigers. A machine built to look does not kill. His own side had a name for him, though. His fellow pilots, half in awe and half in disbelief, called him the Mad Major. Newspapers would call him something better, something that stuck, something that turned an Illinois school teacher into a legend printed in stars and stripes and read by every GI on the continent. They called him Bazooka Charlie. To understand how a mild-mannered teacher ended up dive-bombing tiger tanks in a fabric airplane, grinning, you have to go back to a farm in Illinois and to a restless man who spent his whole life certain that he was meant to be in the middle of the fight and not ever on the sidelines, watching it. Charles Marston Carpenter was born on August 29, 1912, in Edgington, Illinois, a speck of a farm town in the flat green country along the Mississippi, the kind of place where the biggest news of the year was the county fair. There's a small, perfect piece of trivia about the day he was born. The local paper's headline that day trumpeted the fair's aviation exhibition. Aviation events, big fair feature. The boy who would one day turn a toy airplane into a tank killer came into the world under a headline about flight. He could not have read it, but it hung over his cradle like a promise. Flight would have to wait a long time. Carpenter's childhood was not gentle. His parents divorced when he was young, a rare and hard thing in rural Illinois in the 1920s, and he and his siblings worked neighbors' farms to help the family scrape by. He grew up knowing the weight of a hay bale and the ache of a long day's labor. And he grew up with something else too, a hunger to understand the wider world beyond the cornfields. He was smart. He was curious. He read. So in a decision that tells you everything about him, the farm boy became a teacher. Specifically, a teacher of history. He stood in front of classrooms of Illinois teenagers and told them about the great convulsions of the human story, the wars and the empires, the revolutions and the men and women who had, at the hinge points of history, chosen to act rather than watch. He married. He had a daughter, Carol. He built the settled, decent, unremarkable life of a Midwestern schoolteacher. The mortgage, the lesson plans, the summers, the small town that knew his name. He should have been content. By every external measure, he had everything a man of his time and place was supposed to want. There was a restlessness in Charles Carpenter that the classroom could not hold. He was a man who taught history, who stood every day in front of the story of people who had done things. And some part of him could not shake the feeling that he was meant to be a participant, not a narrator. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, physically fearless, allergic to caution, drawn to the center of things. A teacher's life is many wonderful things. Dangerous is not one of them. And somewhere in Charles Carpenter, a compass needle kept swinging toward danger. And in December 1941, the world caught fire, and the history teacher finally had his hinge point. He did not have to go. He was nearly 30 when America entered the war. Older than the flood of teenage volunteers, established in a respected civilian profession, a husband and father with every reasonable excuse to stay home and teach the war rather than fight it. Teachers were needed. Fathers were exempted from the worst of it. No one would have thought less of Charles Carpenter for spending the war at a chalkboard. In 1942, Charles Carpenter enlisted anyway. He was going to be part of the story now. He just had no idea yet that the Army, in its infinite wisdom, was about to hand the most aggressive man in Illinois the single most passive, harmless, defenseless job in the entire United States military. And that he would refuse with every fiber of his being to do it the way it was meant to be done. They made him a spotter. Of all the jobs in the wartime Army, the one Charles Carpenter drew was the observation pilot, and the aircraft he was given to fly was the L-4 Grasshopper, the military version of the civilian Piper Cub. It is important to understand what came later, to understand exactly what this airplane was and what it was not. The L-4 was tiny. It was slow. A cruising speed you could nearly match in a fast car. It was built of a steel tube frame stretched over doped fabric, cloth essentially, and wood, and a little four-cylinder engine that made about as much power as a modest motorcycle. It carried no armor. It carried no guns. It carried a pilot and, usually, an artillery observer crammed in behind him, and its entire reason for existing was to float slowly above the battlefield, high enough to see and low enough to matter, and to radio back the enemy's position so that the big guns could do the killing. The Germans, with grudging affection, sometimes called these puttering little planes Maytag Messerschmitts, after the washing machine engine note. They were the eyes of the artillery. They were never, ever the fist. For a certain kind of pilot, it was a fine job. You were useful. You were essential, even. You saw everything and you touched nothing, and if you were careful and lucky, you might come home. For Charles Carpenter, it was a slow torture. He was posted to France in 1944 and attached to the 4th Armored Division, the spearhead of General George Patton's Third Army, the hard-charging tip of the American breakout that was, that summer and fall, racing across France faster than anyone had believed possible. Carpenter flew above the tanks he served day after day, and what he saw drove him half mad. He would spot a column of German armor. He would radio it in, and then he would circle, helpless, unarmed, a spectator strapped into a lawn chair at 500 feet, and watch as the German tanks, warned by the very presence of his circling Cub, scattered into the trees and slipped away before the artillery or the fighter bombers could arrive. He was watching the enemy escape, over and over. He had a front row seat to a war he was not allowed to touch, and every tank that got away was, to his mind, American soldiers who would have to face that tank later, on the ground, and die. The history teacher who had always suspected he was meant to be a participant was at last in the middle of the greatest event of his century. And the Army had handed him a pair of binoculars and told him to keep his hands to himself. Charles Carpenter was constitutionally incapable of keeping his hands to himself. And so, in the endless downtime between missions, on some grass airstrip in liberated France, the Mad Major began to have an idea, a ridiculous idea. Genuinely insane idea, the kind of idea that gets a man laughed at, or grounded, or killed. He looked at the infantry's bazookas, the shoulder-fired tubes that foot soldiers used, at terrible short range, to knock out tanks. And he looked at his flimsy, harmless, unarmed little Cub, and he wondered what would happen if he put the two together. The mechanics thought he was joking. Then they thought he was crazy. Then they got out their tools and helped him do it anyway, because that was the effect Charles Carpenter had on people. The idea was simple to say and absurd to attempt. He would mount bazookas, the M1 anti-tank rocket launchers, directly onto his airplane. Not one, not two, 6 of them, in 2 clusters of 3, lashed to the jury struts beneath the wings, wired to a homemade firing switch he could reach from the cockpit. He would turn the eyes of the artillery into a weapon. He would take the most defenseless aircraft on the front and make it a tank destroyer. There were 100 reasons it should not work. The bazooka was designed to be fired from the ground at close range, its rockets slow and short-legged and wildly imprecise past a few hundred feet. To hit anything, Carpenter would have to fly his fabric airplane directly at the target, low, slow, and straight, into the teeth of every rifle, machine gun, and anti-aircraft weapon the Germans had. The backblast of the rockets threatened to scorch his own wings. The recoil and drag played havoc with an airframe never stressed for any of this. And a Piper Cub aimed at a Tiger tank is, on paper, a suicide note. He named the airplane Rosie the Rocketer, a wink at Rosie the Riveter, the woman on the poster building the weapons of war. And he painted the name on the cowling, and he went hunting. And it worked. It worked because Charles Carpenter flew the little plane the way no sane man would. He came in low over the hedgerows, engine puttering, and he pointed Rosie at the thin top armor of German tanks, the roof and the engine deck, the places where even a bazooka's modest warhead could punch through. And he pressed the switch and the rockets leapt off the struts trailing smoke, and armored vehicles began to die. When his 6 tubes were empty, he did the truly outrageous thing. He landed in a field near the front and reloaded the bazookas by hand, 1 tube at a time, and took off again to make another run. In a single day's action, he is credited with firing on the order of 16 rockets in repeated attacks. The official tally that would attach to his name is almost impossible to believe. 6 German tanks destroyed, including 2 Tigers, the 60-ton steel monsters that terrified entire Allied tank battalions, plus a string of other armored vehicles, a spotter plane, a history teacher, 6 tanks. The story was too good to stay quiet, and it didn't. War correspondents found him. Stars and Stripes, the newspaper read by every American serviceman in the theater, ran the tale of the observation pilot who bolted bazookas to his Cub and went tank hunting. Civilian magazines picked it up, and the nickname was born, the one that would outlive the man, Bazooka Charlie. His comrades, who flew the same fragile Cubs and knew exactly how insane his attacks were, called him the Mad Major, and they did not mean it entirely as a compliment, and they did not mean it entirely as an insult, and they were right on both counts. The Germans, meanwhile, were learning to do the one thing they had never before had to do about a Piper Cub. They were learning to look up and to be afraid. By the autumn of 1944, around the great tank battles at Arracourt, Bazooka Charlie had become something the war had no category for. Arracourt was one of the largest armored clashes on the Western Front. Patton's 4th Armored Division against powerful German Panzer brigades in fog and mud and confusion. And into that maelstrom of steel flew Charles Carpenter in his cloth airplane, hunting. The accounts of his actions there read like folklore, except that they happened. The little Cub wheeling over the battlefield, diving on armor, landing to rearm, climbing back into the fight while the great tank duel raged below him. The story that best captures who he was is not even an air story. It is the day Charles Carpenter got out of his airplane and got into a tank. During one German attack, with the situation on the ground desperate, Carpenter, an airman, a man with no business anywhere near a tank turret, climbed aboard an M4 Sherman and took a hand in the ground fight, manning the tank's 50 caliber machine gun to help beat back the assault. In the chaos and smoke of the action, the story goes, he even directed fire onto a friendly vehicle, a bulldozer-equipped Sherman, with the dozer destroyed, but mercifully its crew spared. It was exactly the kind of gloriously reckless, chain-of-command shredding thing that gets a man court-martialed. And for a moment, it nearly did. Carpenter was reportedly arrested in the field and threatened with charges. He had, after all, appointed himself to a war he was only supposed to observe, strapped weapons to an aircraft that regulations never imagine armed, and inserted himself into a ground battle that was none of his affair. Charles Carpenter had one thing going for him that no regulation could overcome. He was fighting in Patton's Third Army, and George S. Patton was not a man who punished aggression. When the story reached him of the observation pilot bolting bazookas to a cub and killing tigers and jumping onto Shermans to man the guns, Patton did not see a discipline problem. He saw exactly the animal he wanted in his army. The court-martial was struck, and instead of a reprimand, Charles Carpenter was given the Silver Star, one of the nation's highest decorations for gallantry, with Patton reportedly declaring that Carpenter was the kind of fighting man he wanted under his command. Think about the distance traveled. A history teacher from Edgington, Illinois, who 2 years earlier had been grading essays, was now being personally celebrated by the most famous and most demanding combat general in the United States Army for the crime of being too aggressive in a plane made of cloth. He collected more than the Silver Star before the end, a second award of it, a Bronze Star, Air Medals, a rank that would climb eventually to lieutenant colonel. But the medals were never the point for Carpenter, and by his own later account, he shrugged off the hero talk. He had wanted his whole life to be in the middle of the great story instead of narrating it from the edge. For one incandescent year, he had gotten his wish, and the story was about to ask him for the bill. Every pass Charles Carpenter made cost something, even when the tank blew up and the Cub flew home. Stop and picture honestly what he was doing. To fire a bazooka from an airplane with any hope of a hit, he had to fly low, treetop low, and slow and straight, holding the little Cub steady on a run directly toward armored vehicles surrounded by soldiers with rifles and machine guns and flak. He had no armor between his body and their bullets, only fabric, thin enough to poke a finger through. He was, on every attack, the slowest, softest, most predictable target on the battlefield, deliberately presenting himself to the enemy at point-blank range. Fighter-bomber pilots flashed over a target at 400 miles an hour and were gone. Charles Carpenter came puttering in at 60 and hung there in the crosshairs and pressed a switch and hoped. That he survived it at all is its own kind of miracle. That he did it again and kept doing it is the part that shades from courage into something harder to name. The mad major indeed. And then the war handed him an enemy he could not dive on. At some point during or near the end of his service, Charles Carpenter fell ill, and the diagnosis was cancer, Hodgkin's disease. The prognosis was grim. By some accounts, he was given only a short time to live. The man who had cheated German flak and Tiger tanks and his own commander's patience now faced the one adversary that does not miss and cannot be outflown. He left the Army in 1946. Here is where the tall tale of Bazooka Charlie would, in a movie, fade to black. The hero riding off, doomed and glorious, into a short and tragic sunset. Except Charles Carpenter refused that ending too. He was given a couple of years. He took 20, he went home to Illinois. And the man who had killed Tiger tanks from a Piper Cub, who had been decorated by Patton, who had been a legend in Stars and Stripes read by millions of soldiers, that man walked back into a high school classroom, picked up the chalk, and went back to teaching history to teenagers in Urbana, Illinois, as if none of it had ever happened. Imagine being one of his students. You're a teenager in Urbana, Illinois, in the 1950s, slouched at a desk on a warm afternoon, half listening to Mr. Carpenter talk about some ancient battle, some distant general, some old story about men who chose to act at the hinge points of history. He is a good teacher, warm, a little intense, clearly in love with the material. He is also, you have vaguely heard, a veteran, like half the men in town. You have no idea. You have absolutely no idea that the mild man at the chalkboard once bolted 6 bazookas to an airplane made of cloth and dove on Tiger tanks. That General Patton pinned a medal on his chest. That soldiers across an entire continent once read his name and grinned and said, "Did you hear what that crazy pilot did?" Because he didn't tell you. By the accounts of those who knew him, Charles Carpenter did not trade on Bazooka Charlie. He did not hold the classroom hostage with war stories. He had wanted once to be in history rather than merely to teach it. And having been, more thoroughly than almost any teacher who ever lived, he came quietly home and went back to the humbler, harder, longer work of handing history to the next generation. He taught in Urbana until the end. The cancer that was supposed to take him in 2 years let him have 2 decades. 2 decades of lesson plans and report cards and ordinary Tuesdays. the ordinary life he had once been so desperate to escape and had, perhaps, learned to treasure. Charles Marston Carpenter died on March 22, 1966, at the age of 53, a history teacher in a small Illinois city, known to his neighbors as a good man and to almost none of them as a legend. And that, for a long time, was where the story rested. Bazooka Charlie faded, the way most of the greatest generation's wildest tales faded, into yellowed newspaper clippings, into a daughter's memories, into the footnotes of the war. But the story had one more turn left in it, and it belongs not to the man, but to the machine. Rosie the Rocketer, the actual airplane, the cloth and tube Piper Cub that a history teacher once flew against the might of the German army, survived. It survived the war and it survived the decades, drifting through owners and hangars and countries, an anonymous old cub with a forgotten name painted somewhere under later coats. And in 2019, it was found and identified and brought home to the United States and lovingly restored, not to a static museum pose, but to flying condition. Today, the very airplane that Charles Carpenter aimed at Tiger tanks takes to the air again at the American Heritage Museum, its improbable name back on the cowling, a small yellow miracle putt-putting across the same sky it once turned into a hunting ground. Which means that if you stand in the right field on the right day, you can still watch Rosie the Rocketer fly. And when you do, remember what everyone, the German tankers, the army brass, sober military logic itself, got so completely wrong about that harmless little plane and the mild man who flew it. They saw fabric and wood and a sewing machine engine. They saw a spotter, a spectator, a thing that watched. They saw a school teacher too old and too settled to matter. They never looked up in time. Because the most dangerous thing on that battlefield was never the 60-ton Tiger with its terrible gun. It was the little yellow airplane that everyone underestimated, flown by a history teacher who simply refused to watch history happen without him.